I drew an analogy of a junkie dying in a back alley with a needle in his arm, and then a much-loved young man at the funeral of a much-loved young man where 400 people came and praised his talents and qualities. This is not a statistic, this is the same person. This is my son. We live in Australia. In the 1990s, I was living on the North Shore, which is middle-class, well-educated area, and I was a father of 3 children and several stepchildren. So like any other parent, I guess we had alcohol issues occasionally. Some of the kids used cannabis, but nothing prepared me for finding out that my son Damien, at the age of 21, was using heroin and was in fact dependent. There was a period of 12 to 18 months where I wasn't aware that he had a heroin dependency. I knew there was something wrong, and I tried to find out what was wrong, but it wasn't until he came clean and admitted everything, and then I had a period of 12 months or so of dealing with that. And again, I think, for a long part of that 12 months leading up to his death, I believed that we'd solved the problem, and that was part of my denial. It was part of Damien's struggle to give up the drug. He wasn't using it regularly, and therefore he was vulnerable to overdose, which is always the case. So after the shock of Damien telling me that he was using heroin, I guess my next steps were to try and get help, and I guess that's where I hit a lot of problems, because I couldn't find help anywhere. Everywhere I turned to, there was really nothing that really looked at what families needed. So the treatment services particularly wouldn't talk to me. They said that, because he was over 21, they couldn't speak to me directly, that I could only find stuff out from the library. I did try a couple of support services that were supposed to help families, but I felt their models weren't appropriate. It was very tough sort of stuff that I was getting, and all I wanted to do was to help support him and try and get him off drugs. And so it was a very lonely time, and I then found that speaking to friends and workmates was just as bad. That the messages I got from them was, oh dear, you've had it now. It's a downward spiral to the end now, and he's going to bleed you dry. He's going to pinch all your money, and you've got to let him hit rock bottom. You've got to kick him out. So those messages weren't very helpful, and I found that it wasn't helpful talking to people. So then we internalized it. We dealt with it as a family, which is what a lot of families do. Certainly back then, and still to this day, a lot of them keep it internal because of the negative stigma that they get when they try and talk about drugs. It went cold turkey. And I think he attended 1 or 2 12-step meetings, but not wholeheartedly. And even though he'd given up heroin for a period of time, he was drinking alcohol. And again, that was something I just didn't have any idea that, in fact, that was just a diversion into another drug of his dependency. I didn't recognize it. I thought we'd dealt with the heroin dependency, and so therefore when he died, it was a huge shock. It was in early 1997 that he overdosed and died. It took the police 3 days to notify me. When they did, it was by telephone. By the time I identified his body, he'd already had a post-mortem carried out without my knowledge or consent. I did find subsequently that they removed all his internal organs, and they weren't ever replaced. They were taken to a university for students to practice on, and that was a practice that was common in Australia. Nobody found out about that until 12 months after I went public, when a whistleblower from the morgue told me. The messages I was getting from everybody involved in his death, the police, the mortuary attendants, was he was just another junkie, somebody who was worthless. And yet for me, he was somebody who, even though he had his drug problems, I still loved, still saw him as more of a person than just a drug user. And he'd struggled really hard in the 12 months leading up to his death to give up heroin. And so I had the shock of the death, I had the grief of losing my son. Now, I have to say that my knowledge about heroin and about everything we've talked about today came after his death. I was actually quite ignorant. I was very ignorant at the time he told me he was using, and I was still quite ignorant at the point of his death. I didn't even know about pharmacotherapies. The term harm minimization would have meant nothing to me. If you'd asked me before I knew Damien was using drugs whether I believed in zero tolerance harm minimization, I wouldn't have had a really strong opinion. I like to think I would have been humanitarian, but I honestly don't know. I was ignorant. I drew an analogy of a junkie dying in a back alley with a needle in his arm, and then a much-loved young man at the funeral of a much-loved young man where 400 people came and praised his talents and qualities. This is not a statistic, this is the same person. This is my son, and we are losing 4 people a day in Australia to heroin because we're not doing things that might save their lives.